Good morning. Hi there. My name is Emily Underwood. I work in community engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. And on behalf of MHS, I want to welcome you to this edition of STL History Live. Thank you so much for joining us virtually this morning for Downtown Dining in St. Louis, presented by Magdalene Link. Before we get to that, I do want to mention a few things. Of course, safety is a top priority for us, so all of our programming is virtual right now, but the Missouri History Museum is open Wednesday through Sunday. We have several safety precautions in place. We would love for you to visit if you feel safe doing so. Advanced reservations are required to visit both the Missouri History Museum and the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. You can visit mohistory.org to plan your visit and reserve your free tickets. Our library and research center is currently closed to the public, but remote assistance is available. So you can find a contact form for that on our website as well. I want to thank all of the Missouri Historical Society members for your support. We're so grateful for your contribution and helping us to keep history alive. And if you aren't a member yet, we would love for you to consider joining today. You can do that by visiting mohistory.org/support, and I'll post that link in the chat in a little bit. I also want to thank everybody in the St. Louis City and County region for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. Our STL History Live programs take place mostly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. We also have monthly Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chat programs, which take place on a Wednesday at noon. You can find the entire lineup of programs coming up at the events calendar at mohistory.org. You can also find them listed under the events on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. And if you're unable to join us live, or if you just want to go back and rewatch a video at some point or share it with some friends, you can also find most of our STL History Live programs on the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel. So please be sure to check that out. And finally, when you close out of the program today, you'll notice that a tab should have opened in your browser. It has a brief survey in it. We really value your feedback, so we hope that you'll take a minute or two to fill that out and let us know what you thought about the program. So we sincerely appreciate that. Thank you very much in advance. And at this time, I'm going to turn the screen over to Magdalene Link. She's going to share some stories with you of bygone restaurants from the St. Louis downtown area. And if you have any questions for Magdalene, you can post those in the Q&A, which you'll find in your toolbox. And we'll get to those, we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. I'm sorry, Magdalene, that I didn't do that before, but I'm going to turn the screen over. Thanks again for joining us, and the screen is yours.
All right, so good morning, everyone. And I apologize in advance. My cat has decided to start walking around in circles, so she may appear briefly. But anyway, so thank you all so much for joining me. So like Emily said, this talk is titled Dining in Downtown St. Louis. And we're gonna look at 4 different restaurants that were downtown from about the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. All right, so the first restaurant we're going to talk about is Barnum's Hotel. And so this gentleman right here is Theron Barnum, and he was born in Vermont in 1803, and he spent many years working alongside family members in various kind of agricultural and railroad enterprises as a young man. And during his teenage years, he kind of went out and sought a more traditional education, and he eventually pursued a qualification in teaching. And while he was kind of working in school and was, having other jobs on the side, he was a clerk in a shop, and his uncle, Dave Barnum, who owned the Baltimore Hotel, in 1825, invited him to come and do some work for him in his spare time. And the Barnum Hotel in Baltimore was known as the best hotel in the United States at that point in time. And eventually he really took to this job, kind of put aside his teaching ambitions and just kind of threw himself fully into the hotel business. He kind of took notice of, visitors who were traveling west and, really just wanted to stay for a night or so. And really kind of took advantage of a really hearty breakfast before boarding a train. And then he also took notice of the travelers who were coming to the area, not because they wanted to explore the city, but because they wanted to explore the countryside. So, similar to these, guests who are traveling west, they kind of wanted to also take advantage of this, kind of more full, hearty breakfast, and then, a nice hearty meal upon their return. And Theron eventually moved to Philadelphia, where he operated the Philadelphia Hotel for a few years. He sold the hotel after not too long, and made his way to St. Louis in March of 1840 with his wife, Mary Leigh Chadwick. He took over the City Hotel, which was located on 3rd and Vine, in the spring of 1848, and he operated the City Hotel until September of 1852, when he decided to retire from the hotel business. And this daguerreotype, which we can see here, was taken by Thomas Easterly. And though it isn't dated, it's almost certainly from, his time that he was in St. Louis. And despite his retirement, Barnum was solicited by numerous people to kind of get back into the hotel game. And he enlisted the help of a George R. Taylor, and together they built Barnum's Hotel, which we can see here, and it was located at 2nd and Walnut. And so here we can see Barnum's Hotel as it was depicted on Copton and Dry's Pictorial St. Louis, and I've circled the hotel there in yellow. And next to the hotel, I put an arrow next to the old cathedral, which is still standing, so you can kind of get your bearings. So this hotel is, where the arch grounds are today, essentially. And Barnum spent about $300,000 at the time, which is probably close to about $10 million today. And to furnish the hotel, he spent around $80,000 at the time, which is around $2.5 million today. So it was a pretty hefty, financial venture. And the hotel was 4 stories tall, and it had 200 rooms, and it officially opened on September 28th, 1854. And so the next 2 ads are from the 1870s and really show how well the Barnum name became, established in the hotel world. In St. Louis, the 4th city, it's noted that, quote, no distinguished visitor came to St. Louis without hearing of the highly favored stew, the recipe for which Barnum guarded jealously. And here in this ad, you can actually see mention of the meals and the prices, and kind of noting that the meals are, first class. And this ad down here shows that the family kind of continued to expand the Barnum name across to the East Coast. So it really is just an example of how that family name was really a powerhouse in the hotel industry in the 19th century. And so if you notice here, it kind of mentions, his brother and, his sons. So it was really a family venture that, he started off with his uncle, he kind of caught the bug, and then it just kind of continued to explode, as you will. And so here we can see a menu, and this menu is one of the earliest from the library's collection. It is from November 9th of 1856. Most of the menus in the collection are 20th century menus, but we do have a few that are from the mid 19th century. So this one is particularly unique. And so here we can see a better view of the illustration of the hotel and a bit more about the hotel itself. So shortly after it opened is when this illustration was done, And in this hotel, in addition to these, the 200 guest rooms that it had a gentleman's ordinary, which was a type of dining or social room. And that room had space for about 400 guests. And there was also a ladies' ordinary, which could seat around 250. There was a state-of-the-art warming station for meats in the dining room that involved, a cast iron stand that was kept warm by steam from a boiler in the basement. And there was also a pastry room and a storeroom that was kind of said to hold a larger quantity of groceries than are usually found in retail grocery stores. So you can imagine just how large and, how just kind of full and busy this hotel must have been at the time. And here we can see the dining schedule hours for meals. And it's a bit different than what we're used to today, because as you can see, dinner is in the middle of the day, starting at 1:30 and ending at 3 o'clock. And it's followed by a later tea and a supper. So here is a close-up of the menu itself, and we're going to take a closer look at some of the food offerings there, because it is quite interesting, and some of it is very different than what we're used to today. So this close-up is the entrees, the roast, and the game. And so you can see things that are a bit unusual in American cuisine today, such as, stewed kidneys or a baked calf's head or pig's feet stuffed with sage. But then you see things that are very similar, such as pork and beans, macaroni and cheese, which is exactly what you think it is, and then fried pork steaks with Robert sauce. And I looked up Robert or Robert sauce, as it was more likely said, and it's actually just like a brown mustard sauce. So, things that are, really stood the test of time, as it were, and things that kind of fell by the wayside for, any number of reasons. And then here we have a close-up of some of the dessert menu, which is always one of my favorite places to look for things. And we can see things that are almost the entire thing is very recognizable. You have custard puddings, apple pies, vanilla ice cream, meringues, cream puffs, and then, almonds, raisins, and apples. So a very familiar, but also unfamiliar menu, but definitely, a menu that is very indicative of the time in which it's from. So we're going to jump forward a little bit in time to about the turn of the century, and we're going to look at Duffy's restaurant. So not the Duffy's that was or the Duff's that was in the Central West End, nor the Duffy's Tavern, which more people are probably familiar with, but this predates both of those. And so here we can see on one side we have the Duffy's restaurant menu, and this menu is from about 1911. So Joseph W. Duffy opened Duffy's restaurant around 1908, and like I said, the menu here is from just a few years after it opened in 1911. And there were 3 different locations for this restaurant downtown. There was one at 704 to 706 Pine, one at 114 North 6th Street, and one at 711 Washington Avenue. And I've marked them here on kind of a modern Google map with some red stars, so you can kind of get an idea of where they were and kind of where they would be if they were there today. What's interesting about this restaurant is that Joseph Duffy also opened a farm in South St. Louis County near Watson and Denny Roads. So this is not the best image, but this is from the inside of the menu. And as you can see here, it's kind of a full farm, had all kinds of land, did all sorts of stuff. And the farm produced pork and veal, eggs, poultry, and dairy, all for the restaurants downtown. And it seems as though, Joseph Duffy was kind of a proponent of the kind of mentality of local sustainable business practices, eating things that are locally grown, that sort of thing, which, is very contemporary, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with today. However, we're going to soon find out that this restaurant is far more complicated, and the business model is not quite as contemporary and as fortuitous as it might seem. So here we can see an ad, and this particular advertisement kind of gives us a little bit of background for what the farm might have been like, where it might have been. So I wasn't 100% sure where the actual farm was. I couldn't find, a precise location, and I couldn't find it marked on a map. However, this ad kind of mentions something that really kind of matches in terms of location and, what they were advertising for. And this close-up of a map down here is from a few years later, 1923, but I did kind of circle where this would have been. So currently, with Lindbergh Boulevard and with, highways 270 and 44, it was a little bit difficult. And South County has, really gone through some, renovation over time, but you can definitely see like the area that it would have been in. So, kind of in between, if you're thinking today, definitely in Sunset Hills, sort of in between 44 and, like the Sunset Country Club. So in that area. And here we have an interior view of Duffy's restaurant from 1910. And I'm not certain which precise location this is. It was not indicated. It was just indicated that it was the restaurant. But you can see that the interior of this restaurant has a mix of tables and counter seating, as well as, all sorts of little cases which are selling cigars and cigarettes and candies and other sort of novelties. And you can really picture this space being full of people, during lunch. That it really would have been bustling and busy, with all sorts of people coming in and out of, department stores and businesses and running errands and, taking business meetings and this, that, and the other. So you can really kind of picture the space being in use. And so next we're going to look at the actual contents of the menu itself. So as we can see here, the inside of the Duffy's menu has tons of stuff in it. It contains a whole section on steaks and chops, and I believe if I counted correctly, there were 60 different offerings in that section alone, which is completely absurd. And the prices are really all over the place. They range anywhere from, a quarter to $1.25 at the time. So today that's about $7 to about $35. So a really wide range of prices. And next we had some sandwiches. So you can see things that, more standard, common today, like chicken, turkey, corned beef, ham and egg. But then you also have, less common options, such as sardine or tongue or cream cheese and caviar as well. I'm not sure how a caviar sandwich would be. But my favorite option on the sandwich menu is the St. Paul, which is a sandwich that I'm sure many people are familiar with because you can get it at pretty much any Chinese restaurant locally. And I could go on at length about, the suspected origins of the St. Paul. So I'm not going to do that now, but if you want, feel free to ask me about that. But it does exist this far back in time. And the last thing we can see is this drink menu and farinaceous, which is a word that I'm not too familiar with, wasn't familiar with until I saw it on the menu. But two kind of more interesting sections. And, we can see under drinks that there's things like cream and half and buttermilk. And, I'm lactose intolerant, so I really don't see the appeal of wanting to drink, a large glass of half and half or a large glass of cream, but, different strokes. And, this other menu, not a word again that I was familiar with, but when I looked it up, it was things that had a mealy texture. And that is exactly what you have here. And again, things such as oatmeal or, graham crackers, that sort of thing, shredded wheat, perfectly normal. But then there are other things that I'm, quite certain have been lost to time, such as the combination of grape nuts in heavy cream, which I just can't quite seem to get on board with. All right, so we're going to kind of switch over to kind of exploring, the kind of side of Duffy's restaurant that really kind of was far more interesting than I was really anticipating. So the more I investigated the restaurant, the more complicated the story of the restaurant itself became. And so when looking for Joseph Duffy in the newspaper, the first mention I found of him was in 1908, and he was arrested as part of a very convoluted insurance fraud scheme. And according to his former chauffeur and a female companion of his, Duffy had instructed his chauffeur to burn down his automobile so that he could collect insurance money. And apparently Duffy ended up keeping all the money for himself, which caused his chauffeur to go to the police and let them know of their scheme. And Duffy said that that was all a lie, it was all a farce, and that he was just jealous and seeking revenge. And, he was mad that he had been let go from his job. And so I was like, well, that's, not great, but let's keep going and see what else there is. Well, in early February of 1911, Duffy was in trouble again, as he was found to be in violation of the city's smoke ordinance. He was fined $100 at the time, which was really quite a substantial amount. And over the next 3 years, he was found to be in violation of the smoke ordinance 5 more times. So each time it resulted in a warrant being issued and he had to appear in court, and at least one of the times it resulted in his arrest. And, smoke ordinance violations at the time were a really serious issue in the United States and, other countries as well, because, thick, dark smoke created, hazardous living and working conditions, and also, turned the sky dark, essentially. And, just a few years prior to Duffy being kind of arrested, the Globe Democrat noted that, the darkness caused by coal smoke led to the temporary closure of many area public schools. So this was a really serious problem that, people were dealing with. And as time went on, the efforts to control the usage of coal continued and were more targeted at these business owners who just continued to refuse to abide by these kind of government guidelines at the time. So unfortunately for Joseph Duffy, his troubles continued. In October of 1911, the Globe Democrat mentioned Duffy's in a list of establishments that were illegally selling skimmed milk. And this, again, was just an issue of quality control and food regulations at the time. In March 1912, a busboy working at the Pine Street location fell from a platform and was seriously wounded when he was impaled on an ice pick, which is pretty horrendous. But from what I can tell, he did eventually recover after a stay in the hospital. Later that same month, the restaurant was caught handling fraudulent checks that bear the name Edward A. Faust, which, clearly were fraudulent, given that that was the name associated with the Faust beer family. And, it's a really confusing story that I couldn't quite wrap my head around, but it involved some back and forth and some shady business dealings with a rat catcher. And, eventually in 1913, I came across this ad, and this is one of the last ads I could find from the restaurant. And they were kind of rated as having a 95% purity rating by the state health inspector. And to be completely honest, it sort of seems like a last-ditch effort to clean up their act and sort of save themselves from an inevitable closure. And the last mention of Duffy's restaurants and Joseph W. Duffy are in the 1914 city directory, after which point they both disappear completely. And, it's really not surprising. So I can only imagine what happened to Mr. Duffy after his restaurants closed. But, all considered, this was a fairly dramatic and drama-filled run for a restaurant group that really lasted a little more than 5 years. So now I'm going to change themes completely and go to something utterly different, and that is Baby Week. So in March 1916, across the United States, cities celebrated Baby Week. And the menu we can see here is from a special Baby Week luncheon that was held at Stixpayer and Fuller Department Store. And it was announced in January of 1916 that there was going to be a nationwide Baby Week during the first week of March. And at the time that this was announced, 400 communities from every state were planning to observe the event. About a month later, in February of 1916, Mayor Keel formally set aside March 4th through the 11th as Baby Week in the city of St. Louis. And this headline and illustration from the Globe Democrat was part of a formal announcement, and it sort of gives some information about the event and reasons behind it. And it was, really focused on childcare and preventable infant mortality. So here we can see on the far left a photograph of the Stixpayer and Fuller Department Store, which was located at 601 Washington. The building still stands. I believe it's part of it's a hotel and the other part of it is lofts. And on the right here, we can see some of what was planned for Baby Week. The Women's Council and the Children's Clinic of Washington University supervised a series of lectures, clinics, and promotional material for mothers in the area that celebrated them while also educating and promoting health and wellness. Stixbury and Fuller transformed part of their building to house a clinic and to act as the headquarters for the Visiting Nurses Association of St. Louis during this event. So there were lectures about infant feeding, preventable tuberculosis, surgical obstetrics, and then other advancements that had been made in pediatrics, gynecology, and child psychology. And of course, this was all accompanied by sales and in-store promotions. And while it was kind of a savvy way of marketing, from everything I was reading in different newspapers, it really seemed like a lot of department stores were part of the event because they had such large spaces, and they had a mix of spaces in their buildings. They had restaurants, they had, obviously their sales floors, and then some of them even had event rooms. And they also had a lot of foot traffic. And at this point in time, there wasn't a huge number of places where you could spread this type of information to such a wide audience. Outside of smaller venues like churches and schools and other community spaces, this was probably the best way to reach as many women and caregivers as possible. So here we can see some of the advertisements and for different sales and promotions that were happening during the event. And another thing that should be noted is that, this really would have been a way for caregivers to potentially purchase items that were safer for children and infants, whether it, be, fabrics that clothing was made out of, or, innovations in, different cribs or, child furniture, that sort of thing. And this all brings us back to the Baby Week luncheon. So referred to as the Baby Welfare Luncheon in newspapers, this luncheon provided another way for the public to interact with, physicians and nurses and qualified women's club leaders. So on the left here, we can see the menu, and this is probably one of my favorite menus in the collection because it's just incredibly cute. Sometimes we joke in the library that sometimes we have to keep things because they are cute. And this is, obviously it has a St. Louis connection, but it is incredibly adorable. So for about $12 by today's standards, you had your choice of some really adorably pint-sized dishes. You could start with a consomme ABC or a shrimp cocktail. And this would be followed by baby trout, small filet mignon, or a half-fried young chicken, served with baked potato and baby peas. And after this was a grapefruit salad. And then your choice of an infant pudding or angel or strawberry ice cream. And to drink, bottled milk, tea, or coffee. And I'm not sure what the infant pudding is, but my guess is probably some sort of kind of plain vanilla custard or pudding topped with maybe like a simple whipped cream. And I love this menu because I think it's very clever and it's inventive and it's just really fun and it's just so adorable. Who wouldn't want to, have a bottle of milk with their lunch? The image of it is just delightful in my opinion. And, as it turns out, Stixbury and Fuller were not the only ones to host a special baby welfare luncheon. I found this advertisement for a similar luncheon at Famous Bar, and it does feature some kind of Baby Week inspired foods with a young vegetable soup and a roast milk-fed duckling and buttered baby beets. But I just don't think that it's as inventive. And this advertisement does have that really precious little illustration at the top. And we don't actually have the in-store menu from this event in our collection, but something tells me that it just wouldn't be as adorable. It'd be a pale imitation of the Stixbury and Fuller Baby Week menu. And Baby Week was a huge local and national success, and across the United States, over 1,700 different communities participated in some way. So some of them, larger cities had, week-long events. Other cities, just ran little one-off clinics or, did food drives or, any number of things. And local leaders really applauded the event and adopted the slogan, "Healthier babies, healthier mothers for a healthier, wealthier city." All right, and we are going to jump to our final menu and restaurant. And this, before we get there though, we have to do a little bit of background. And we're going to talk just briefly about Hop Alley. And so Hop Alley was located downtown between Market and Walnut and 7th and 8th. So I've seen some accounts that say that it kind of stretched all the way up to 10th Street, but the bulk of the businesses were in this, kind of one block area. And it was where there were a lot of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. And so on the left here, we can see a picture of Hop Alley, and this is looking north on 8th between Walnut and Market. And it's often noted that Hop Alley was destroyed to make way for Busch Stadium in the 1960s, but it was kind of destroyed a bit earlier than that in the 1950s when, there was the start of the big push for all these downtown revitalization efforts. And as you can see here on the right, I've kind of circled in yellow where Hop Alley would be kind of today. So you can see where it is in relation to Busch Stadium. And in the early 20th century, there was not a large Chinese population in St. Louis. And this small neighborhood acted as sort of a hub for those who were in the metro area, really. It was full of businesses owned by and catering to Chinese immigrants, and it was frequented by those who lived both in and out of the neighborhood, and was like really, really a cultural hub. Much in the same way that Cherokee Street is a cultural hub for the Mexican community today, and the Hill has always been kind of a hub for the Italian community. And so now that you have a little bit of background on, the Chinese immigrant community, we're going to look at a menu for the Orient, a restaurant which was owned by the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. So the Strand Theater we can see here was opened in October of 1914 as a 500-seat movie theater at 419 North 6th Street. And this is just a few blocks north of Hop Alley, across from what is now the Federal Reserve Building. So the theater was designed by T.P. Barnett and Antonio Berni, and Berni focused primarily on the facade. And it was named after the Strand Theater in New York. And when it opened, it was the 22nd moving picture theater to open in the city. So the exterior of the building featured a mix of kind of Asian designs and motifs in red and gold. And the interior of the building had dark walls of ivory, olive green, and gold. And it had deep red floor tiles. So it's a really kind of a luscious building. And the restaurant opened in May of 1917, several years after the theater itself opened its doors. It was open from 11 a.m. to 2 a.m., which is really incredible hours. However, given that they were located above a movie theater, it kind of makes sense that they would want to, bring as much of the movie crowd into their doors as possible, especially since, at this point in time, it was not uncommon for people to spend all day kind of watching movies. And the restaurant was opened by Joe Lin. And Joe Lin was a first-generation Chinese American who moved to St. Louis from San Francisco around the end of 1912, though I've seen some accounts that say it was maybe a little bit earlier or a little bit later. And his original intention was to work as a laundryman. And after several years, though, he saved up enough money that he was able to open a restaurant, and he opened the Orient. And here we can see his passport photo. And, even though the restaurant wasn't located in Hop Alley directly, I think that, Lin probably saw an opportunity to expand into the surrounding area and sort of widen the reach of the Chinese immigrant community at the time. So the next few slides are going to show the interior of the menu. The restaurant specialized in both Chinese and American dishes, and guests were able to choose from an incredibly extensive menu of close to 500 items. And I've only included copies of the parts of the Chinese menu, because if we looked at the whole thing, we'd be here, it'd be all day. It's so extensive and so long. And, dishes on the Chinese menu, such as ham, egg foo young, or shrimp fried rice, or chow mein, are really staples of, Chinese American cuisine even today. And the advertisement we can see here on the right is from the Orient's opening in 1917, and it mentions that they have an extensive menu of, over 400 items, and that they're available to host afternoon tea parties in their tea room, and small banquets, in addition to everyday dinners. So they were really trying to bring people into the doors, and kind of market themselves. Yes, they were a Chinese restaurant, but they wanted to kind of bring in the same types of crowds, and we're kind of encouraging the similar types of visitors, I think, to any restaurant that had that much space to fill. And things on the before I go any further, things on the American menu were really typical of American restaurants at the time. So liver and onions, beef, different preparations of beef, different sandwiches. So kind of similar to the Duffy's menu we saw earlier, but really just pretty standard but very extensive menu. So the Orient restaurant really thrived, even though the Strand Theater kind of faded away back into obscurity. The restaurant stayed at its North 6th Street location above the theater I wasn't entirely sure how long, but eventually they moved about a block away to 414 North 7th Street. And it was during this time that Joe Lin really became a noted leader in the Chinese community. So I have his obituary here on the other side of the screen. And, I've read countless obituaries of him that have tons of information about his life. And he was the national president of the Onliang, which was a Chinese merchant and labor association of the Eastern United States. He was also active in relief work for China, having been the president of the Chinese Emergency Relief of St. Louis. And it was also noted that he acted as an interpreter for immigration and the naturalization department at the time. When Lin died on December 13th of 1947, a truly incredible remembrance followed. A 30-piece band provided music for the funeral service. The service was attended by over 300 individuals. About a third of those people were other Chinese community leaders from 28 different cities in the US. The service was done twice. The first time it was done entirely in Cantonese, and then it was done in English. And it was followed by a procession which was led by the band and included 57 limousines, 4 cars of flowers, and 12 policemen on motorcycles. I've read accounts that said that traffic was blocked up, even with the police escort. That traffic was blocked up for about 6 blocks at a time while this procession went through the city. And it went from the funeral home on Washington, closer to the Central West End, to the restaurant downtown, where it stopped. The band performed several songs. There was another remembrance in front of the restaurant. And then the procession went to Valhalla Cemetery in North County. So the Orient moved again in the 1950s, and this was for the final time. And it was located at 505 North 7th, and it remained there until it closed at the end of 1967, after nearly 50 years in business, despite what that headline might lead you to believe. And, Joe Lin was really no doubt, truly an innovator and a pioneer, I think, at this particular point in time. And I think that, having a Chinese American restaurant in St. Louis at the time, when the entire Chinese population was really only several hundred people, was truly at risk. But, it clearly paid off and turned him into a very important and beloved figure in that community. And, probably paved the way for, different, for that community to continue to expand and kind of grow into what it is today. And, I did some quick searching today, and I'm not, without looking at menus from this point in time, I can't say exactly how many Chinese restaurants there were in St. Louis, but I will say that today, doing my best to kind of cobble together some estimates based on what I was able to see online, there's probably over 500 different Chinese and Chinese American restaurants in the metro area. So it went from maybe being just a handful to being several hundred. And, you know, arguably Chinese food is as American as, you know, apple pie, as people say. So that kind of concludes my kind of look at a bunch of different, four different restaurants and establishments from St. Louis, downtown dining in St. Louis Pass. So I'm, you know, more than happy to answer questions at this point in time. If anything about the presentation, or if you just have a question about the library or menus in general, I'm more than happy to give it a shot.
Thank you so much, Magdalene. As Magdalene said, if you've got questions, you can post those in the Q&A, but I have to ask you to go back a little bit and give us the story on the St. Paul sandwich, because you mentioned that before.
Yeah, so from what I can tell, the St. Paul sandwich was, well, okay, I will caveat this by saying that it's, just because I see it mentioned by name in other places, I cannot guarantee that the ingredients of the sandwich were the same. However, I have seen references to this sandwich actually being sold like in St. Paul in the early 1900s. And it really, was just mentioned like, you know, when I would see little ads in newspapers. I also saw it mentioned in some other, you know, newspapers and, you know, like the Midwest. So again, not 100% sure that that's the same sandwich. However, there is a reference in a St. Louis newspaper, and I, off the top of my head, can't remember the year, but somebody does write like a letter to the editor, the food editor, asking what the ingredients for this St. Paul sandwich are. And the ingredients are it's really simple. I believe it's like eggs, green onions, and ham. So it's you know, really simplified version of what you would get today, but like, that's gotta be the same thing. And so my theory is that it kind of fell out. It's a sandwich that kind of fell out of fashion in other cities for whatever reason, and caught on here. And I think it caught on here because Chinese restaurants were already making things such as egg foo young, which are essentially the same thing, but, you know, put it in between two pieces of bread instead of serving it with gravy, and like you have a sandwich, and with very little modification of ingredients you already have. So I kind of think that perhaps it was something that, you know, for whatever reason caught on here, and probably caught on here because, you know, more than just kind of a standard American restaurants were kind of looking at, you know, what they could do with it. But I think it's an incredibly delicious sandwich, and truly it's a shame that it doesn't exist anywhere else, in my opinion. And, you know, I'm sure people can go on at length about where they think they can get the best one. But yeah, it does show up in in more menus than you might think, especially as far back as, you know, the 19 teens, maybe a little bit earlier. And it's always cheap, and it's always, you know, shows up in the weirdest places. I've seen it in like hotels. I've seen it in, you know, more classy dining establishments. It seemed like, you know, just like today, can't get enough. So.
That actually brings me, since you mentioned kind of ended on Chinese restaurants and there's the connection with the St. Paul sandwich, I am curious, and you may not know the answer to this, but you know, we talk a lot about the Americanization of Chinese food, and I'm curious if that was something that, you know, was that sort of already a standardized sort of model that Jolin was following from other restaurants, or do you know anything about kind of how those menus were developed for American tastes?
So there's some good documentaries. There's actually a great documentary called The Search for General Tso, I believe, that a Chinese, I believe it was, I can't remember if the person is a food historian or if they're just kind of a historian on immigrant communities. But they kind of suggest that it was kind of, this all started, you know, back when, you know, kind of during the gold rush, really, when people, and, you know, railroad boom, when, you know, tons of Chinese immigrants were coming to America, and they were kind of adapting dishes that they knew people could easily recognize. So, you know, you say chop suey, and like everyone knows what chopped up vegetables looks like. everyone knows what rice looks like, people know
Mm.
what noodles are. And so if you just like kind of, but you put a different name with it, then people are like, oh, it's something different, when really it's, I think they were kind of starting with things that they knew people would recognize.
Mm.
And then kind of evolving it from there, little tweaks here and there. The Orient menu really, I think because it has so much stuff on it, a lot of the dishes that are on it will say kind of really simply what it is, like chicken with broccoli. So you know exactly what you're getting. And so I think that like, even if it included other ingredients, I think calling it something very simple was probably a very smart thing on, the part of certainly Joe Lin, but, probably countless other Chinese restaurants at the time, or really, probably any type of food that you're trying to get people, immigrant food that you're kind of trying to get people to get on board with, that's kind of not standard, European cuisine. I think that, it's fairly common to just have people kind of explain, really what the dish, ingredients, as opposed to giving it a name, because you don't necessarily know the name, but like, what chicken is, what beef is, what certain vegetables are, like, what the word soup is. So it kind of, makes it a bit more approachable that way.
Well, and I was curious also, obviously, on all the menus you showed, I mean, with the exception of the baby menu, they were very extensive.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
we don't see in them the way we see in most menus today. Not all, but most menus now have some kind of a descriptive piece explaining what that dish is. So I
Mm-hmm.
was curious if you've been able to see kind of when that shift happened to more concise and more descriptive menus. And then kind of a follow-up to that, I guess, is just generally, are there any trends that you've been able to sort of notice as you look at menus from different areas, trends either in dining style or in just culinary taste through the years?
Yeah, so if you definitely look at, older menus, they are, I think that the Barnum's Hotel menu is a little bit of an exception because that was from a hotel. And so it's not going to be, super extensive, even though the hotel was kind of listed, said that they had all of the stuff in their, they had a grocery store in their facilities. But that Duffy's menu, where there were 60 different items for just like chopped meat and steak, which is utterly ridiculous in my opinion. But if you look at
Overwhelming.
it, it was very repetitious. It was all the same thing. So it was like steak with onions, veal with onions, pork with onions, like hamburger with onions. And so it's really common, probably like well into the mid 20th century, for menus to just have these kind of absurdly long lists of things. But if you actually look at them, it's a lot of repetition. It's just a lot of the same thing over and over again. Whereas today, you might just see like, here are your meat options, here are your toppings. What do you want? Like, build it yourself. Like, oh, I want to have like this with these two things on top, and it will cost this much. And so that definitely continues, that is definitely a thing on menus well into the mid 20th century, as far as I can see. You really don't get more concise menus, I would say, until probably the 50s or 60s. And a lot of the ones we have from that time period in the collection at the library are from department stores, or they're from hotels, that sort of thing. But they, or the Fred Harvey restaurant at Union Station, where they are far more limited, but they're really, they look exactly like a menu would today. And the other funny thing that I kind of notice is kind of about dining trends is that occasionally you will see like certain names of sandwiches or desserts or drinks listed over and over and over again, as if everyone's supposed to know what, like, a bevo is. Like, I've seen that on ice cream parlor menus. I have no idea what a bevo is if it comes from an ice cream shop. Like, just some sort of ice cream sundae, but like there's never a description, but it will appear in like multiple places. So it kind of implies that, like, just like today, people would know, what, I don't know, was in, like a breakfast burrito or something. Like, there's kind of an expectation in your head of like what's in a breakfast burrito, but like there are certain dishes that have far more specific names where I'm just like, I don't know what this is, but like it will appear so many times and you're just like, well, I guess they all seem to know, or, there are sandwiches that are, be called like the Manhattan. It's like, what? No idea what's on the Manhattan sandwich. I can speculate what's on it. It's probably named after a hotel or something, or, fancy restaurant, but it's never a description. It just kind of implies that, again, people are all on the same page. But that's really it really, I think, kind of falls from favor in, probably with, I would guess it probably goes away as more people kind of start to cook more unusual, quote unquote, unusual things at home. As Betty Crocker cookbooks kind of explode, and like Joy of Cooking explodes, where like people are exposed to hundreds of recipes. Then they kind of know what they can, kind of have more of an expectation of what they're getting, and kind of don't necessarily need as much hand holding, I guess, when they're going out, when they're dining out.
You'd mentioned that a lot of what's in our collection are from hotels and from department stores. I know obviously drugstores were connected with sort of diners and things like that also. So to what extent do you know, at least to what extent the restaurant industry was kind of connected to the shopping and hospitality industries versus sort of standalone restaurant establishments?
Right.
Early on?
So from what I can tell, it was, I don't want to say expected, but it was kind of, because department stores really sold everything for, many, many, many years. You could truly buy anything you needed at a department store. And some of them even, went into dry goods. And, Famous Bar downtown had a whole floor that was like food offerings. And some of it was packaged food, some of it was dry goods, some of it was, fancy pastries and candies. But I think that there was, once the kind of model of the department store came into being, that serving people food was almost a no-brainer, because it makes people stay in the store longer. Right. So like, why wouldn't you serve food? Like, because, you get, in a department store that's, 10 stories tall, you get tired going up and down stairs. To my knowledge, there weren't always escalators. So, like you would need to, stop off, even if it is for just, a bowl of soup. I can't remember the number of soup stands, but I do know that like when the French onion soup really exploded in the Famous Bar restaurant, that there were like standalone soup carts in Famous Bar department stores everywhere that they were located.
Wow.
And so like you could just like stop off very quickly, get a bowl of soup, get, maybe a small sandwich, maybe a salad, probably a slice of, so whatever dessert they had right there, sit at a tiny table and eat it, and then get right back to shopping. So I think that that was kind of a way for people, to just make more money. But also, they kind of acknowledged that like shopping was an all day event. You had to, it was, you went out in the morning and then you stayed all day until you were done. You got dressed up to go shopping. Of course, different times. Even last year you could have gotten dressed up to go shopping, but not today. Get dressed up to go to the kitchen. But, I think that, that model really has always been linked. And as far as standalone restaurants go, you kind of are looking at, prior to the 20th century, not a ton of standalone restaurants. There are a few exceptions, but a lot of what you're seeing are taverns that maybe focus more on drinking or, that kind of thing, and kind of small things like oysters. Really common to have like, an oyster house just sell oysters and beer and nothing else. And then a lot of the stuff is also though connected to inns and hotels and that sort of thing. So you have like, those are your kind of options if you're, kind of going out to eat. So it's not necessarily that people weren't going out to eat, but it was far more of a special thing that was almost definitely connected to the fact that you were going, on a trip, or you were, getting on a train ride, or you were on vacation, that sort of thing. Whereas, it's far more common to just like stop off at, a tavern down the street, have a drink, maybe a bowl of soup, and then, get back to work or head home.
Right. And do you see the decline of the department store restaurants? I mean, I know there were some even not that long ago, to be honest. There were a few restaurants that were still around in a few lunchrooms that were still around in some department stores. But was that connected with the sort of advent of the shopping mall and eventually that sort of food court in the shopping mall that would maybe take the place of those types of.
Yeah, definitely. Because you go from having, one gigantic standalone store to having one gigantic store, which is then connected to like several other gigantic department stores, which is then, in between all of those are smaller specialty stores. And so, if you, think about, the Galleria or something, there's a Nordstrom, there's a Famous, like, well, I'm probably going to get all this wrong, but like there's a Macy's. But it's like you have all of these different places, and so you're not necessarily going to the mall to go to one store. Now some people are, but it's like, why stop just at the department store if I can go, if I need stationery, I can go to the stationery store. Like, oh, I want to look at some furniture, so I'll go to the home goods like store. I want to build a bear, so I'll go get a toy. And then then you just so happen to be hungry, and then there are entire restaurants. There's the food court model, which are tiny restaurants, but then you have an entire multiple entire restaurants in the same complex. And so there's really not necessarily a need per se for those kind of more standalone specialty things. Now it did exist, like you said, depending on, and it was really the kind of, I keep thinking of like the Famous downtown, where like, until the bitter end, there was still a restaurant there, regardless of what else was happening. But like, it really kind of, and even at Crestwood Mall, it really sort of eventually just like faded away and was just not nearly as busy. That said, though, if the food was good, they still brought in the clientele, as is clearly demonstrated. I keep talking about Famous Bar, but like the food was good. So like people clearly were still going there just to eat. So,
right. And people still look for that soup recipe too. I know that occasionally publishes that. I do want to just acknowledge a comment that we got in the Q&A about a potential future program on the Clean Air Crusade, because you did mention about the clean air issues that were coming because of coal power, and that was a big, St. Louis was a real hub of that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. It's a great idea, as well as stuff about, I think, the Pure Foods movement, which I thought about when you were talking about the Duffy's and their last ditch effort with their ads for 95% pure food.
Yes.
But I did want to we're getting close to the end of time, but I wanted to close out just by asking you about how the Historical Society collects current menus. I know, sadly, with COVID, there's been a lot of restaurant closures. I mean, there are restaurant closures all the time anyway. So how are we collecting current menus? Is that something that you look for people to donate, or is that, I don't want to suddenly have a flood of menus coming to you?
So it's interesting. So the thing about a lot of our menus, we do have a really wide range of them, from about the 1840s, I believe, is the earliest one, all the way up to, like we have a bread company menu that does not say Panera on it. It says St. Louis Bread Company. And, like an Emo's Pizza, like Dogtown Pizza. So we do have some Cyrano's. So we do have some ones from, the 2000s. But a lot of them are donations. And for, it's really like, it's kind of an odd area of collecting, because you can't really go to a restaurant per se and like while you're sitting there just be like, oh, by the way, like, can I have this like nice plastic covered menu that you have, take it home with me. But I think of all of the times I've gone to different delis or takeout places where they've stuck a paper menu in my bag and then I've just thrown it in the recycling bin. Like, those are the types of menus that we actually don't have. I think it's definitely something that we would 100% love to, get from the public, and have people kind of, if people have menus, even if they are menus that like, you just have like too many on your refrigerator, like, let us know, like, we might be interested in them. Because, there are all kinds of places that like, 20, 30 years from now, people are going to ask us for them, and we're not going to, like, if we don't, if people don't donate them to us, we're not going to have them. Right. I think of, unfortunately, one of the things I think of is like, I think we have maybe one menu from a restaurant on the hill. And part of that is, an issue because some of those like delis and smaller kind of corner stores and grocery stores don't necessarily have a printed menu. In
Right.
place like, Crown Candy, for instance, never had a printed menu in all of the years that like I was going there. It was always just on the wall. So there are some places where it's impossible to get one, but there are, especially with, restaurant closures now and, this kind of increased boom in, takeaway and curbside pickup and delivery services. I think far more restaurants are probably putting things out. And so, it's, we try our best to remember to save them, but like everyone else, we're human and sometimes they end up in the recycling bin. They get stuck on the refrigerator. So definitely if anyone has any menus, feel free to reach out to the library and like we'll be more than happy to see, if it's something that we're missing from our collection, and get in touch with you and figure out, the best way to get that from you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Magdalene, thank you. Those are some really good stories. I love listening to all these stories of the old restaurants. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today for the program. Hope that you'll join us for more upcoming programs. You can see I put up a slide that has a few of our next programs coming up. So I hope you can make it to those. If you can't, like I said, you can find most of those on our YouTube channel. Usually they're posted within a couple days of the live program. And of course, you can share those with other people. Give them a thumbs up if you like them so more people can find them. And please don't forget to fill out the survey that'll pop up in your toolbar, in your browser after the program is over. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.